Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Reish, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society. And I thank you for joining me this evening for the inaugural event of the recently reformed New York chapter of the Society. If you're not yet a member and you'd like to learn more about the Society, you can do so by going to winstonchurchill.org. Now, before we begin, I have two announcements that I'd like to make for everyone right now. So the first is we will be having a Q&A section of this event later in the event, and please submit your questions using the question and answer function of Zoom. Furthermore, if you'd like to interact with the other participants, you can use the chat function where you can tell us where you're from and where you're dialing in from. Second, this event is being recorded and it will be on the Society's YouTube page for future viewing. So I'd now like to have both of our guests join me and unmute themselves, and I will happily introduce the new president of the ICS New York chapter, Jeff Rage. Thank you so much for reforming this chapter, Jeff. And I'm going to hand it over to you now, and you can introduce our guest speaker.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And Justin said, I'm Jeff Rage. I'm the president of the New York chapter, and somewhere out in Zoom land is Alex Hoffman. And Alex is the vice president of our chapter. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This is really exciting for me. We're delighted to be able to restart the chapter here in New York. We really think that with all that New York has to offer, we're going to be putting together great programs in the years to come. If you want to learn about the chapter specifically, our website, it's churchillsociety.ny.com. You can also send me an email, churchillsociety.ny@gmail.com. We will be holding quarterly meetings, 3 in the city, 1 in Westchester County. We're going to hopefully have great programming, and as we'll talk later, we already have another big event lined up for November. So we hope you'll join us and be part of our group. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you our very first speaker, Catherine Grace Katz. As you'll hear from her background, I am in awe of what she's been able to do. But Catherine graduated from Harvard in 2013. Actually, I just realized when we were talking backstage that she grew up in New York. So she's an honorary member of our New York chapter now, near me where I grew up. So she went to Harvard in 2013, where she got her BA. She then went to Christ College, University of Cambridge, graduated in 2014. So when she came back, she was working in Manhattan, and I'm sure she'll talk about it, but at the bottom of her building was a little bookstore called Chartwell Books. And she had a fortuitous meeting in that bookstore, which we'll talk about. But currently, she is at Harvard Law School, where she is earning her JD. And as I understand it, Catherine, you finished the book during your first year of law school. A lawyer myself, I know how you did. So anyway, it is my honor and pleasure to turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that very kind invitation to speak with all of you this evening and for that very, very generous introduction. I am honored to be the inaugural speaker of the Reformed Churchill Society of New York. As Jeff mentioned, I have been a New Yorker at various times in my life. I was born in Manhattan, ended up moving to Bronxville with my family when I was really little. We moved to Chicago, got transferred back with my dad's job, lived in Bronxville again, transferred back to Chicago. So I think I can be an honorary New Yorker despite currently being in Chicago and having spent the most time in Winnetka, Illinois, just north of Chicago, with some time in Boston. But I have not lost my love for the New York Yankees. The Yankees remain my team. No amount of time in Boston can persuade me otherwise. So hopefully I can be an honorary member of your New York group that way. There was no active Churchill Society in New York when I was living there working as a financial analyst, which kind of led to the fortuitous meeting that began the story of this book, which I'll tell you about in a second. But I am so glad that it is now thriving and alive, because there is so much about New York and Churchill's life and just the connections between the people that he worked with most closely throughout his career, that it only seems natural and fitting that the Churchill Society would have a strong presence in New York. And so I'm so glad to see that that is the case once more. So thank you so much, Jeff, for making that possible. So I thought I would begin this evening by sharing a couple of photographs, some of which you may have seen before, some that might be new to you. They were certainly new to me when I started this endeavor. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the backstory behind the book, and a bit about each of the daughters in particular, and then would love to take any questions you have, answer give any more information, things that you'd like to know more about, or just hear kind of general thoughts. So I'll get started by sharing my screen to show some of those photographs with you. So I'd love to start here with this very famous photograph of the Second World War. You can see Churchill, FDR, Stalin sitting together with their military advisors behind them. And this is in the courtyard of Lavaria Palace during the Yalta Conference in February 1945. And you can tell so much about what's going on in the world just looking at the expression on their faces. Each of them grimacing in a way. You can really see that they carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. And you can, this is not surprising given what they've come to Yalta to discuss. At this point in the war in Europe looks like it's finally going to be winding down towards the late spring, early summer. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended by the time they arrive at Yalta. And so now they have important matters that they need to talk about regarding the end of the war, namely what to do about Germany when it's all over. Should Germany be allowed to remain one nation, or should it be broken up into smaller countries in hopes that they can't rise up as a belligerent for a third time in half a century? Also extremely important, especially to Churchill, is the future of Poland and Polish sovereignty. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset, and Churchill does not want to return to London and look the Polish government in exile in the eye and say that they weren't able to secure that objective that they went to war to defend in the first place. Stalin, however, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. He is paranoid by the same thing that has been a source of paranoia for many Russian leaders before him, dating back to the Tsarist era. And that's the weakness on their western flank. They've been invaded through the flatlands of Poland multiple times throughout history, dating back to the Napoleonic times. And Stalin wants to make sure that after all the sacrifices the Soviet Union has made in fighting this war, that they have friendly neighbors, as he calls it, on their borders. Roosevelt, however, is a little bit more oriented towards the Pacific at this point. He doesn't yet know if the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb will be a success. And he's looking at, if it's not, potential need for ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers and take another 18 months. And he wants to save as many American lives as possible. To do this, he wants to draw the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, have them break their pact of neutrality with the Japanese in exchange for territorial concessions that Stalin has his eye on. FDR also has a more personal goal. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I with the League of Nations, and leave kind of adds his personal legacy to the world, an organization of peace. One that can perhaps not guarantee eternal peace, as that's probably too lofty a goal, but at least peace in Europe, especially peace in Europe for 50 years. And so he wants to create this organization of United Nations, not only to secure peace, but also as a way to bring the Soviet Union into the international community after the war is over and the common enemy has been defeated. Something that I didn't really stop to consider until I began writing this book was just what it took to get to Yalta. And that tells you a little bit more about why they look so haggard and exhausted in this photograph. That's because it was an absolute ordeal to even make it to the Crimea. At this point in the war, Stalin recognizes that he holds more cards than do his allied partners, and so if they want to meet, they're going to have to come to him. He's paranoid about leaving his security apparatus around him in the Soviet Union. He claims it's because his doctors advise him against traveling for the reason that he can't leave his own borders. Meanwhile, Roosevelt is actually dying of congestive heart failure at this point. However, Roosevelt and Churchill are determined to meet with Stalin, so they agree to make this ordeal, this arduous journey all the way out to the Crimea. And if you think about the kinds of summits and international conferences that take place today, no security team, no advance team would possibly allow their principals to undertake something this dangerous in this day and age. But they do it. Churchill first flies 1,300 miles to Malta, where he will rendezvous with FDR. Very tragically, on the way to Malta, one of the planes members of the Foreign Office delegation goes down off the coast of Italy, and several delegates are killed, which really casts a shadow over the beginning of the conference for the British. Roosevelt, meanwhile, has a week-long journey by ship across the Atlantic Ocean by destroyer convoy, and they're still actually sighting enemy U-boats as they're traveling. So this is not a safe journey by any means. Once they rendezvous at Malta, which prompts the apocryphal Stalin quip, "I said Yalta, not Malta." They have to fly a further almost 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands where there are anti-aircraft units that could potentially shoot at the low-altitude unpressurized planes. They finally land in the Crimea at an airfield, which is far too short, dangerously short for the kinds of planes that they fly. And miraculously, they make a safe landing and then have to drive a further 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, before they finally arrive on the coast of the Black Sea and at Lavaria Palace, the former summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. This was once a beautiful palace, a haven away from the pressures of court life for the Tsar and his family, where they would swim in the sea and ride horses and play tennis and really enjoy their time as a family. But of course, all of this changed in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, and the Soviets nationalized Lavaria Palace after the Tsar and his family were brutally murdered. When the war broke out and the Nazis invaded the Crimea, they used Lavaria Palace as their Crimean headquarters. And when the Soviets pushed them out in return several months before the Yalta Conference, the Nazis stripped the palace of absolutely everything they could carry: the furniture, the lamps, the dishes, the art, even down to the doorknobs, which they could strip out and use as scrap metal back home. So the Soviets have just 3 weeks from the time the three delegations agree that this is going to be the site of the meeting to turn this ransacked palace into a site fit for one of the most important meetings in world history. So they take the contents of glamorous hotels like the Hotel Metropole in Moscow and cart it 1,000 miles south by train and frantically restock the villa, throwing manpower at the situation, which is what the Soviets do best. And what they can't get enough of that way, they just requisition out of the homes of everyday people living in the area, people whose lives have been pretty summarily destroyed by the war. And so by the time everyone arrives at Yalta, it looks pretty grand and lovely on the surface, and yet, like so many things in the Soviet Union, what you see on the surface is not exactly indicative of that which lies just beneath. Of course, lurking in shadowy corners in Lavaria Palace, there are bugs of both the electronic and espionage variety and the natural variety. Bed bugs they'd infiltrated Lavaria Palace at this point, and the advanced teams have to come through and douse the palace in DDT, which we now know is not a great idea. However, we think of this as a glamorous site and a glamorous setting, but it just really is remarkable what it took to actually physically get to Yalta and the conditions that they found once they arrived there. So looking at the context of that, you can understand a bit more about why they all look the way they do in this photograph. But what's also really interesting about this photograph is looking at it in tandem with another, a picture that's taken of the exact same scene, just a few moments apart, but it shows a very different perspective and one that we don't see very often. You can see in this sister photograph, two young women off to the side of the image. In fact, there were three young women, these being Sarah Churchill, who was 30 years old, Kathleen Harriman, the daughter of the ambassador to the Soviet Union, April Harriman. Kathleen was 27, and Anna Roosevelt, the president's daughter, was 38. And Anna's the one not in this picture, but you can see her on newsreel footage of the same scene. And seeing this photograph as I began my research made me stop and think about this moment in history that we think that we know so well, but in a way that I had never really stopped to consider before. First, of all the people that these leaders could have brought with them to serve as their aides at this conference, what was unique about the skills and abilities and experiences of their daughters that made them the perfect individuals to come with them and serve as their aides at this moment on the precipice between World War and Cold War? The other, and I think perhaps even more important thing that I began to think about was, we put these men on a pedestal, the great men of history, to the point, they're so elevated that they seem larger than life, greater than human, almost godlike. And yet, at the end of the day, they were just someone's dad as well. And what would it be like to have that person as your father, especially when you're together at one of these moments in history? So I want to tell you a little bit about each of the daughters in turn, but before I get to them, I want to introduce you to another young girl, and that's me in third grade. I think it was pretty clear from a very early age that I would love history. I grew up loving movies like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape. My grandfather had served in the Navy during World War II, and I used to chase him around with the legal pad, asking him to tell me his stories about serving in the Navy and the wartime memories that he had. And I also was really fortunate to grow up in a family that loved to read. My mom would read aloud to us every night before bed, and we'd spend hours together on the porch in the summertime when she'd read classic children's series to us, lots of British literature as well. And it just really instilled in me a love of reading. And some of my favorite stories were about girls who wanted to grow up to become authors, like Anne of Green Gables or Laura Ingalls from Little House, the Little House series. But the other great thing about growing up in Winnetka, where I lived most of my childhood when I was not in New York, was that we had the chance to really engage with history, especially the local history. For us in the Midwest, of course, this is the pioneer story. And we had the opportunity to go and live like pioneer students for a day, experience this pioneer school day, making food in the pioneer room, this log cabin, and really immersing ourselves in this world and putting ourselves into the shoes of people who came before us. And I think that kind of immersive history was something that stayed with me and still is very important to me and shapes the way that I think about history and storytelling. I think it's a surprise to no one that when I went to college, I became a history major. This is a picture of me the morning I turned in my senior thesis, and I had 125 books checked out from the library, which my roommate found very entertaining. So she decided we had to take a picture with all of them. So I, inspired by my love of the movie The Great Escape, I wrote my thesis about British prisoner of war escape narratives and their place in British culture. And what I didn't realize was that while we have this wealth of escape stories from World War II that we know and love today, like Colditz or The Great Escape, Winston Churchill had actually written the first of these types of escape narratives about his own escape from the Boer POW camp in 1899 when he was just 24 years old, and the story of his escape rocketed him to fame in England and launched his political career. So I spent a lot of time unexpectedly with Winston Churchill that year, which was a wonderful thing to spend your time doing. And little did I know that I would soon be spending a lot more time with Churchill in the very near future. After graduating from Harvard, I had the great chance to be able to go to Cambridge, and there is no better place in the world to study history and be surrounded by history everywhere you turn than Cambridge. I loved every minute of my time there, especially the time that I spent with Winston Churchill once again. I was looking at the origins of modern counterintelligence practices during World War I in Britain, where the British government enacted a postal censorship system where they would examine all the inbound and outbound foreign mail, trying to uncover any enemy spy rings in their midst. And the person in charge of this, the Home Secretary, was none other than Winston Churchill. So here I had spent 2 years studying Churchill in great depth, not, however, Churchill's prime minister, which is a bit unusual. And so I unfortunately came to the end of my time at Cambridge and had a crisis in confidence, I suppose, and decided I needed to do what many recent grads do. We think of the smart thing. And I went off to New York to try my hand at finance. Like so many people trading in the idyllic, Cambridge for the hustle and bustle of New York City. I quickly learned that being a financial analyst probably wasn't what I wanted to do long term. Started thinking about applying to law school when my 2-year program was over. But much to my great surprise and delight, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers. I think this is something that can probably only exist in Manhattan, a bookstore that features the books by and about Churchill. And I found myself on afternoons when I'd need a break from Excel modeling, I'd go down to the lobby, saying I was going to go get a coffee, but I'd really be wandering into the bookstore and striking up conversation with the owner, Barry Singer, about all things historical and especially related to Churchill. And it was through Barry that I first got to know the International Churchill Society. As luck would have it, the Churchill Society was having a fundraising dinner across the street from my office at the Waldorf, featuring Madeleine Albright, the keynote speaker. And I'm so excited, here's this opportunity to hear from the former Secretary of State. And so I was very fortunate to be able to attend this dinner. The Churchill Society was so kind, welcoming me in, this young, enthusiastic person who just, really loved history. And I, much to my great fortune, I met so many wonderful people at that dinner, including Randolph and Jenny Churchill, Lee Pollock, Justin's predecessor as the executive director, Lawrence Geller, and David Freeman, the editor of Finest Hour. And shortly after I met the Churchill Society, I learned that the family was opening Sarah's papers to outside researchers for the first time, and that her papers were back at Cambridge. And the Churchill Society kindly asked if I would have any interest in writing an article about her papers for Finest Hour. I said, yes, I would love to do this. Partly, I thought it would just be a great way to stay engaged with history and continue writing, and also a chance to go back to Cambridge, which I loved. But I also had kind of a personal reason why I really was so interested in learning about Sarah's life. And that's because I had had a sort of experience in a way with Sarah from the time I was a very young girl. My family goes to the cloister at Sea Island in Georgia every summer. We've been going every year since I was a baby. And on the wall in the lobby, there's this beautiful photograph of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day in 1949. She had eloped to Sea Island with her second husband, Anthony Beecham, and they'd gotten married. And she wanted to tell her family, I'm so sorry. We just, struck it, the romance struck us and we decided to get married. And so I'd walk past this picture of Sarah every summer since I was a little girl. And here was my chance finally to get to know her. And what amazed me about Sarah was, yes, she has had this career as an actress. Many people will remember her from starring in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But I was really touched reading her letters about her relationship that she had with her father and how that became so important to both of them during the war years. Sarah and Winston had a very special connection ever since Sarah was a little girl. She would say that she could walk in silent step with him, where even if he wasn't speaking, she understood his thoughts and the way that his mind worked. And some of this was through the long hours that they would spend together in the gardens at Chartwell, while Churchill was engaged in one of his favorite pastimes for relaxation, other than painting. This was bricklaying, and Sarah would be out there with him as his assistant. They'd spend these hours in the garden in this quiet, contemplative harmony. Sarah was much like him in wanting to carve out a name for herself and chart her own path, something difficult for a young woman of her class and era to do. But she realized that she could become an actress, and Winston actually was supportive of her decision to do this and was proud of her. And though Sarah fought very hard to carve out a career for herself on stage, when the war broke out and her father became prime minister, she wanted to do her bit for her country. And so she decided to join the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, where she became a reconnaissance intelligence analyst, looking at recon photos taken by pilots thousands of feet in the sky and making intelligence assessments about the kinds of ships that were in enemy harbors based on the shadows that they cast, or whether the grass that had been trampled in the field was down to enemy troop movement or just some cows grazing. And so her work was very important, especially in Allied operations in the Mediterranean, specifically Operation Torch. And sometimes Sarah knew the details of these operations even better than her father did, much to his amusement and pride. But what was also fascinating about Sarah during the war was that she had the opportunity to travel with her father to his wartime conferences, not once, but twice. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine had decided that someone from the family should accompany him on these voyages as a confidant and protector, but also as an unofficial family historian of sorts. They knew that he would want to write his war memoirs after it was all over, as he had done after World War I. And so someone from the family should be with him to record the things that were taking place outside of the official conversations of the conference. Sarah was the perfect person to go with him for several reasons. First, she was a beautiful writer. Much like her father, she really had a command of language, a lyrical way of describing the world around her. And so, as the family in-house historian of sorts, she was really the perfect person to go with him. She understood his mind, as she had learned from the time she was a little girl. This is something that she could help, channel his thoughts, frustrations, and emotions into a productive line of argument. She also understood the inner workings of the war, having served in the military, and also had a great natural grasp of politics, something that was very important to her and to her father. And perhaps if she'd been born 10 years later, she might have even succeeded her father in politics. She really had a real gift for understanding the political situation. And finally, as an actress, acting is so similar to diplomacy in many ways, that she had the right demeanor and outlook to be able to be someone who could function in this very delicate dance of this international negotiation. So off Sarah went to Tehran in 1943 with Winston. She served there as his aide-de-camp, and it's while she was at this conference that two other fathers took note of just how valuable a daughter diplomat could be. The first of these was Averell Harriman, who was at the time one of the wealthiest men in America and the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Averell Harriman had been the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad, the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, banking firm, Newsweek magazine. He founded Sun Valley, the first glamorous American ski resort, which he created to encourage Americans to use his trains to travel out west by giving them a destination to visit. He was not especially close with his daughters when they were young, as he was always off chasing a new business deal, and he and his wife divorced when the girls were little. But it was only after his ex-wife died, when the girls were teenagers, that Averil Harriman really became a prominent figure in their lives. Averil Harriman was not a warm and fuzzy father by any means, but he was very ahead of his time in a sense, in wanting his daughters to be as involved in his professional life to the whatever extent that it interested them. He wrote to them and inviting them to take part in his world if that was something that they wanted to do. His older daughter Mary was not especially interested, but his younger daughter Kathleen jumped at the chance. Kathleen was much like her father. She was extremely adventurous and bold and daring. They were both great athletes. Kathleen was an expert equestrian, crack shot, and an Olympic level skier, and would have been the alternate for the US ski team had the 1940 Olympics not been canceled because of the war. And so when the war broke out and Harriman was tapped to serve as the Lend-Lease envoy in London by Roosevelt before the Americans entered the war, he arranged for Kathleen to be able to come with him to work as a war reporter in the middle of the Blitz, even though she was just 23 years old. And it was in London where they really formed the partnership that would see them through the next few years, where they were in some ways more like a business partners or colleagues than father and daughter. In London, they became very close friends with the Churchill family, so close, in fact, that they were celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news together about Pearl Harbor. And of course, as many of you know, one of the particular Churchills that they were very close to was Pamela, Churchill's daughter-in-law, who was married to Randolph, who was Kathleen's best friend, was 2 years younger than Kathleen. And Kathleen soon realized that Pamela was also having an affair with her father, Averil Harriman. Harriman became the ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943. Kathleen decided to go with him, learn to speak Russian for both of them, and really became his assistant ambassador in many ways. And while she was there, she had more access to and experience with Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. She was such a part of his world that by the time Yalta came, that she was really the perfect choice to accompany him, really as his deputy. She could serve as liaison with her Russian language skills, working with the Soviet and American advance teams to make sure that every detail was overseen, almost like a protocol officer at the State Department today. And also, she was someone who could help bridge the cultural divide between the Soviets and the Americans, the delegates who were coming to the Soviet Union who'd never been there before, creating briefing materials, explaining to them about the local culture and the environment that they were about to enter. Kathleen was also tasked with a very important job of giving a toast on behalf of the three daughters at the conference, speaking in Russian, giving this toast to Stalin and some of his most important colleagues, some of whom were the most fearsome men in the Soviet Union. And I love this photograph of Kathleen, not just because it's Kathleen with a horse, but because this is specifically a horse that was given to her by Stalin at the end of her time in Moscow. The third daughter was Anna Roosevelt, and at 38, she was the oldest of the three daughters who attended Yalta. She was also the only mother among them, but even though she was the president's daughter and the oldest, she was actually the least experienced in the world of foreign policy. I love this photograph of Anna and FDR when Anna's a little girl. This is the two of them together at Campobello Island. And it's one of the few photographs that we have of FDR standing, which is something that we don't see very often. And I love this picture. Anna and FDR were really close when she was a little girl. FDR and Anna both loved the natural world and the environment, and they would spend long hours together on horseback, riding through the Hudson River Valley, learning about the natural world. And Anna dreamed that someday she would grow up to become a co-custodian of sorts of their home Springwood and their land in Hyde Park. But his paralysis from polio changed all this, and Anna suddenly found herself shunted aside, sent off to boarding school while all these doctors and nurses and political colleagues now surrounded FDR at every hour of the day. Her parents insisted that she become a debutante, something that she hated. She spent a little time at Cornell before she made a rebellious marriage at age 20 to a man named Curtis Dahl. She had two children. Sadly, the marriage broke down. But Anna did fall in love again soon after on the campaign trail when her father was running for president, this time with a Republican journalist working for William Randolph Hearst, one of FDR's chief critics. And so in this polarized world today, I think this is one story. It really just goes to show that love can conquer all. So Anna and her husband John moved out to Seattle, where they became the co-editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. They had another baby, but in 1943, John joined the army, shipped out to the Mediterranean, and Anna decided to move home. Home at this time, of course, being the White House. So Anna arrives home for Christmas in 1943, and becomes very alarmed after she arrives because she notices something about her father is just not right. He seems to be staring off into space for a long period of time with his mouth hanging open as if he can't quite get enough oxygen. It's just not as sharp with the details as she remembered, but nobody else seems to have noticed because there's been, subtle change over time. But only Anna, who hasn't seen him for a long time, can see what a drastic change this really is. So she insists that he have a comprehensive medical examination, which he finally agrees to do in the spring of 1944, which reveals that he's in fact dying of congestive heart failure. Anna and the doctor are the only people who know. They're sworn to secrecy. And surprisingly, FDR never once asks what's wrong with him. He doesn't want to know about his condition, if he even has a condition. And you can understand this, that you don't want a sense of your own mortality right as you're about to, hopefully you make the final push to win the war. Anna takes it upon herself to protect her father. There's really no cure for congestive heart failure at this time, so all she can do is try to extend his life. She becomes his gatekeeper, trying to helping him decide who really needs an audience with the president, who could meet with someone else. Sometimes going as far as to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who could handle them. Throughout the war, Anna had hoped to join him for one of his overseas conferences, as Sarah Churchill had done at Tehran in 1943. But FDR had always kind of pushed her aside, instead choosing to bring one of her 4 younger brothers with him as his aide at previous conferences, largely as physical supporters to help him stand and move and assist him in that way. But in the winter of 1945, even though he didn't know exactly what was wrong with him, he knew that Anna was doing something to protect him. So he wrote to his friend Churchill and said, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah again to this conference, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna. So Anna finally has her chance to recapture this closeness that she remembered with her father from when she was a little girl and be the person who he values most of all in some of the most important moments. This is something that she has long desired, and here she finally has her chance. But sadly, the cost of this is that, she knows this is probably the last time that he will, likely die in the near future. And so she's carrying this deadly secret as she goes off to Yalta, cherishing this role that she has and the opportunity to be with him, all the while knowing that this is probably her last chance. I love this photograph of the 3 daughters together at Yalta. You can really see a slice of their distinct personalities. You have Sarah in her military uniform, Anna in the middle in a sensible tweed, and Kathleen on the end in an elegant fur coat. And even though they each came to Yalta with distinct skills and abilities that made them the perfect partner for their father at Yalta, they all occupied a similar role as daughter diplomats, where they were there not in an official capacity like someone from the State Department might be, but really kind of speaking with the weight of their fathers behind them, where they can go and deliver subtle, nuanced messages that an official government representative might not be able to do, or hear things and collect information and bring it back to their fathers. They also had a chance to go out into the local community and meet the people in the Crimea whose lives were literally being reordered by the conversations taking place around the conference table at that very moment, and report back to their fathers about what they've seen and some of the differences between the Soviet people and the Soviet leadership. I think this photograph also just reminds you, even for all the lofty geopolitics that something like the Yalta Conference seems to be about exclusively, hard to sometimes relate to those moments in history with our own lives. We don't know what it's like to negotiate across the conference table from Stalin. So what does that have to do with us? But really, I believe that history is fundamentally about relationships, relationships between nations and leaders, but also in this case about the relationships between some really special fathers and their incredibly special daughters. And we may not know what it's like to negotiate with Stalin, but we all know what it's like to be someone's child or to be someone's parent. And so I hope that's something that people can realize about history and about this story in particular. I'll stop sharing my screen there and just close with a few last thoughts about what the experience of these 3 daughters at Yalta could tell us about our world today. One of the things that comes to mind is after the last 2 election cycles, we've had more time to think about the role of the family members in elected officials' public duties more than ever. I love the saying, when you marry someone, you marry their family. To some extent, when you marry someone, when you elect someone, you elect their family in a way. And we've accepted there should be a role for a first spouse in an official way. But what about adult first children? Should they be involved in policy? Is being related to the president a sufficient credential, or should they not be involved at all? Kind of what's the right balance that we need to strike? Also really important, I think, is the relationship between the Western leaders and the Russian leader. I think there's been a temptation throughout history dating back to FDR, as recently with the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, to try to build this personal bond, principle to principle, between the president and the Russian or Soviet leader. And you can see FDR trying so hard to build this relationship with Stalin, much like he has with Churchill, and the personal friendship between Churchill and Roosevelt really being the basis for the special relationship that emerged from the war. But with Stalin, it's a little more difficult. Even if he likes and respects you, which I believe he did with FDR, it's not going to change the way that he approaches foreign policy and what he feels is important to achieve in a setting like Yalta. So I think that that sometimes there is that false sense of security that we have about building this bridge, this leader to leader. And when it comes to the Russians, we can find mutual areas of cooperation, but not rely so much on the leader to leader connection like FDR tried to do, unfortunately, unsuccessfully in this situation. And finally, while I'm so glad that we have the technology to be able to gather this evening and to chat remotely, I think that the story also really highlights the importance of in-person diplomacy. First, you have Churchill and FDR willing to undertake enormous personal danger to even make it to the Crimea to meet with Stalin, because it's so important that they discuss these matters in person. And also FDR's commitment to creating the United Nations as a forum where people from all around the world can gather together. This helps to expedite diplomacy, but also overcome some of these cultural divides that we experience. And so I hope that as soon as everyone is vaccinated and we're able to return to normal, that in-person diplomacy comes back as quickly as possible. I think I'll leave it there, taking a quick look at the clock, and I realize that I want to save plenty of time for questions. So would love to take your questions, hear your thoughts. And so Jeff, do you want to kind of, I don't know, read out any of the questions, or I can take a look at the Q&A, whatever is easiest.
Well, actually, I have a question, and then I would hand it over to Justin to maybe read some of the questions. So first of all, thank you very much. It's just fantastic, discussion of what just an amazing moment in time. And so, I'm the father of a 16-year-old girl, and we do together enjoy history. We actually love Winston Churchill together. And she's, by the way, the secretary of the New York chapter. I've officially given her that role. And so, father-daughter relationships are very, very special. And reading your book, with this theme, really, struck with me. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So, but what, as it relates to fathers and daughters, what lessons, and maybe it's a hard question with these three and actually four, I think Stalin's daughter was also there, but what lessons about those relationships you think we can take away from it?
Yeah, well, just a quick note, Stalin's daughter was there, not physically present, but there in spirit in a way. She did not attend the conference. Stalin did not like her to interact with foreigners, even though she spoke English and could have been a real asset to him. And their relationship was also at a very low point at this time. But she was there in spirit in the form of a brooch that she had sent to Sarah Churchill, kind of a point of daughter-to-daughter diplomacy, and Sarah wore it on her uniform throughout the conference, which I think is lovely. Yeah. But more generally, kind of about relationships between fathers and daughters, I think that whether it's fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, grandparent, grandchild, I think we all in our lives have people who are fundamentally important to us, the people that we rely on at every turn, whenever we have a crisis in confidence or need advice or just someone to talk through a problem. And often this is someone who, whose role doesn't necessarily leave a footprint in the historical record in the way that, a president or a secretary of state might, but we all have that person in our lives, and we all know who that is, and we know that we couldn't get along without them. I think that this story helps to kind of highlight that role, some of those unsung heroes in history and in our own lives. For these fathers, their daughters very much played that role for them. And it's such an important, role that we all have, and it's something that we can all, relate to. And so I'm really glad to be able to shine a light a bit on that role that's often one that's overlooked in history.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And I want to thank all of the attendees for submitting some great questions. So let's get into it. I know people love to hear questions from the author or answered from the author. And I'll begin. So Chris asked a question. He asked, do you think the decisions on how to deal with the German question would have been different if FDR had survived the war?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tempting to go down the counterfactual rabbit hole with FDR. What if FDR had survived? How would relations with Germany been different? Russia been different? Could we have avoided some of the disasters that came out of the Yalta Conference and the real breakdown of relations between East and West? For any of that to have been different, for Poland to have been saved, FDR, I think both FDR and Churchill would have had to have opened the Western Front much earlier, which meant that we would have had to have rearmed much earlier. And so it is kind of this chain of events that leads you to where we are. So that's a tough question. I think FDR at the Yalta Conference, he's discussing Germany. Sometimes he would go into the conversation and kind of go back on reminiscence of childhood days of cycling around Germany with his tutor on a bicycle, and the quaint history of Germany and the differences between the historic Germany and Nazi Germany. And it's hard to tell whether this was him kind of whether it was his illness kind of showing at that time, or if he was using as a very deliberate diversionary tactic to try to bring the temperatures down on the debate about Germany, how to handle them in the post-war period, or even just to kind of get Churchill and Stalin off the conversation about Germany, kick it down the road a little bit. So it's really hard to tell, especially because in situations like that, even his colleagues weren't sure what to make of some of these ways that he was framing the discussion about Germany. So I wish I had a good answer to that, but I think that it's reasonable minds can differ.
Sure. Yeah, counterfactuals are incredibly fun to think about, but are always incredibly difficult to answer.
Yes.
A great question, and this is from an anonymous attendee. Was there one of the daughters with whom you identified with more than the other two? And if so, why did you feel that way?
Yeah, gosh, that's a tough question because they're all such distinct personalities, and you can really see their unique personalities and skills showing through in their letters and their diaries. And it was a real treat to write about each of them. I'd say Sarah was the easiest to write about in a way because she was such an eloquent writer, and really I kind of see her as almost like the conscience of the conference. And so relating the world through her eyes was very easy and enriching to do because of the wonderful material that she left behind. Kathleen Harriman is someone that it's easy to relate to her. She was 27 at the time of Yalta. I was 27 while I was doing the bulk of the research for this book. And so there's a lot that I can relate to about being a young woman kind of maturing over the course of writing this book. And even kind of looking at the difference between Kathy's outlook and Sarah's outlook, Sarah just being 3 years older than Kathy, you can see how much someone matures in those 3 years. And as I feel that I have, in my own life, now being closer to Sarah's age. And, but then with Anna, there is, she was the hardest to write about in some ways because what she experienced was very emotionally challenging. And it's difficult to think about, a parent putting their child into such a complicated role, first, keeping the secret of FDR's health and the fact that he's dying, but also keeping his affair with Lucy Mercer from her mother. So Anna consciously decided to cover up for his ongoing, if not affair in the strict sense, certainly emotional betrayal of Eleanor with Lucy. But Anna justifies this based on, I'm trying to do anything I can to keep my father alive, and if this is the only thing that will work, then I'm willing to do it. And so it's really complicated. And a friend of mine said to me after she finished the book, which I thought was such a nice observation. We all think that we're Kathy's. We aspire to be Sarah's, but in our hearts, we all know that we carry a lot of Anna and what she's experienced. And I think that there's a piece of each of them that's present in each of us.
That's a very thoughtful comment by a friend.
Absolutely.
And I would completely agree with it.
She's a very, very smart friend. I'm very lucky to have her as a friend.
Craig Horn asks, Roosevelt and Stalin tried to marginalize Churchill at Yalta and do business directly with each other. Did Sarah see this from your research? And if so, what was her reaction?
Absolutely. Sarah, astute observer that she was, She really admired FDR from getting to know him, especially at the Tehran conference in 1943. He very kindly toasted her during one of the grand dinners. He said, I toast to you, and if I could get up and come clink glasses with you, I would. But as I can't, I will just toast you from here. And Sarah was very touched by this and knew how deep that bond was between her father and FDR. By the time that they arrive at Malta, you're not even at Yalta yet, but this rendezvous point at Malta, Churchill and FDR meet for the first time on board the USS Quincy, FDR's ship. And immediately after sitting down, Sarah notices that something has changed in the relationship between the two men. And she writes to her mother saying, I noticed that he has different advisors around him now. It's not the same team, the same people that he had with him at Tehran. Something's different. Harry Hopkins seems a little bit more removed. And so she says to her mother, literally, is it his health or has he moved away a little from us? And, unbeknownst to her, it was actually both. And she picked up on that right away. And that frustration that Churchill felt towards FDR, especially his belief that FDR did not appreciate the importance of securing a free and independent Poland after the war. That was something that was a huge source of frustration to Churchill, which Sarah experienced with him in their nightly 2 a.m. kind of privy council discussions behind closed doors, where Sarah and Anthony Eden and Lord Moran were really the only people there that Churchill could trust completely. And then that showed even in Sarah's relationship with Anna, which kind of ebbed and flowed, mirroring the relationship between the president and the prime minister. And by the end, Anna's kind of sticking to FDR's line, we need to end this conference, move on to other business. And Sarah just saying, as if there's anything in the world that's more important than this, kind of taking out that frustration on Anna. So Sarah was completely aware of all of the dynamics at play between the leaders.
I have a request that I don't expect you to uphold, but the next time you do a Stalin quote, if you could say it in his voice, I think that'd be a lot of fun for all attendees.
I might have to, call my brother into that. My brother is he's taking Russian right now. He will be a Russian American foreign policy expert when he's done with his master's at Georgetown. So maybe I'll have him have a Stalin cameo in the future.
When this becomes a play, we'll have him. A question which is very interesting, again, from an anonymous attendee. First, a compliment. You're such an amazing storyteller. And here's the question. Can you share your personal thoughts about Pamela Digby Churchill? I know she's, not one of the main characters, but plays a decent role in this book. What are your personal thoughts?
Oh gosh, Pamela. Well, Pamela has quite a legacy. And I think she's one of these people in history that you either hate that you love or love to hate. She's kind of, very divisive. She was someone who deliberately sought the kind of position in which she put herself. I think that some people today may kind of read about Pamela and think, maybe she is a victim of the patriarchy. I don't think that's the case with Pamela. She was very deliberate about forming the relationships that she did, making them work to her advantage. She wanted to become a power broker, and she admired her relative, Jane Digby, who had been a great courtesan and really wanted to emulate that in her own life. Which I think is maybe a little bit foreign to people today, kind of thinking about this, but that's really how Pamela went about operating. It's, of course you have the affairs during the war. It was wartime. It sometimes seems to me like of the characters in the story that Winston Churchill was the only person not having affairs. Sarah Churchill was having an affair with John Gilbert Winant, the American ambassador to Britain, Harriman and Pamela, Pamela and everybody else in the world. Kathleen had a brief fling with FDR Jr. But one of the things about Pamela that, I don't think I would make the choices personally that she made, is that because so many people were either having affairs with Pamela or were besotted with Pamela, including other people at Yalta in addition to Harriman, Fred Anderson, one of the top American representatives from the military, Peter Portal, the head of the RAF, who just was absolutely enamored by Pamela. So you have all these letters of people, writing to Pamela, showing off, telling her about the Yalta conference, everything that was happening. And then Peter Portal, he literally wrote a 30-page handwritten letter to Pamela about everything taking place at the conference, from the important to the mundane. And he then wanted to hand deliver this letter to Pamela after it was over, go see her in London as an excuse to see her. Well, the benefit of that is that that letter never went through the censor. So we have a complete 30-page letter that hasn't been chopped to pieces like many others. And so my personal feelings about Pamela aside, I'm very glad Pamela existed at this time, because without Pamela, we would have far fewer resources through which we could reconstruct stories like this.
Oh, wow. Yes, Winston Churchill has been criticized for many things, but a philanderer is certainly not one of them.
No.
So just a few more questions, and then we'll let Jeff finish us for the evening. A great question from Alex Hoffman. He or she, excuse me, asks, what was the most difficult aspect of your research when writing your book? Were you able to read any NKVD Russian sources about the daughters? And if so, did anything particularly stand out?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't speak Russian, and with any telling of history, there's some cost-benefit analysis of, do you go and try to find every single source that might be out there in the world? And in dealing with the Russian sources, you have to hire a translator, go through official bureaucratic processes to get that information, and you don't even know what might be there. And if you do, is that the most useful thing to get? So unfortunately, I was not able to go and visit Russian archives. But what was really fortunate is that shortly before I started working on this, there were a number of key sources from Russians who were at Yalta that were recently translated into English, including the former Russian Soviet ambassador to Britain, Ivan Maisky. His diaries were translated into English. David, is it David Reynolds or David? I think it's David Reynolds. His I should know that he was my thesis advisor. He and David Cannadine have both worked in this space. I'm trying to remember whose book is which. David Reynolds had collaborated on a translation of correspondence from Stalin to Roosevelt and Churchill, and just many sources that weren't available in English now are, which is great. The other thing was a real surprise that I was able to access, and this was through a really kind introduction from Randolph Churchill, was the granddaughter of the official Soviet photographer at Yalta had been in touch with him. She had a number of photographs from her grandfather's archives that had not been seen widely in the West. And she very kindly allowed me to see those photographs and include some of them in the book. And it's just a different angle on, again, these scenes that we think that we know really well, but even a slight frame shift can show you something that you didn't know and didn't see before. So while I don't have official NKVD records, unfortunately, and who knows if we'll ever really see the truth of what they were saying, there were a variety of Soviet sources that I was able to use, and I'm very grateful for introductions like that and all the support for so many people who made that access possible.
So last two questions. The first is from an anonymous attendee, and then the second one is from ZK. The anonymous writes, Catherine, if you were going to share advice with newly starting historians or political scientists, what would your top two suggestions be? And then ZK asks, what's next? What's the next topic for you, Catherine? Many of us think you're our nation's best under 50 historian. So incredible praise.
Well, that is very high praise indeed. Oh my goodness, thank you. I'm flattered. I don't think that's true, but thank you. That's very, very kind. Advice I would give historians or political scientists today, I think don't be afraid to re-examine material that it feels like has been, we've gone over 100 times, 1,000 times. What new could there possibly be to say about it? I think Andrew Roberts cited that when he published his Churchill biography 2 years ago, that his was the 1010th biography of Winston Churchill. And yet, sometimes it's because new sources become available, which we didn't know about before, or even because events in our own time make us see things from history that we didn't notice previously. I think there's a temptation to say like, oh, this historical event teaches us X, Y, and Z, and it's kind of set in stone that these are the lessons from this event. But I think that it's much more fluid and evolving, and sometimes you can see things completely differently because a light is shown on them because of things happening today. And so I think that, of course, there's been so much written about World War II, but there will continue to be much left to say. And so I would say, don't be afraid of exploring the things that you think maybe there's nothing new, and maybe there is something new, maybe there is, but also you can draw people into the conversation maybe who thought that they were perhaps intimidated by a certain kind of history, or that it wasn't relevant to them, based on the way that you tell the story and the figures that you choose to relate that story. And I think that history can be very welcoming, and it can be more accessible, especially when it is told as a story without sacrificing any of the academic rigor underneath it. So that's what I would say about that. What am I working on next? Well, I have to finish law school. I have 2 more years of law school, but I absolutely intend to write another book and want to get started on that as soon as possible. I do have an idea for what my next story will be. I really love these kind of slice of time stories where you can see intersecting threads all coming together in one event, which brings together fascinating figures in one moment. And you can see the world changing really quickly in a very short period of time. So looking at something in particular in the late 1930s. Unfortunately, because of COVID, all of the archives are closed. And if you think of, a socially distant activity, I can't imagine one that's more socially distant than archival research. And yet everything is still closed. That's all right. So hopefully everyone gets vaccinated quickly. They're able to reopen archives, and frustrated historians like me all around the world can get back to work on their next books. So that's the state of affairs on my end.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I'll hand it over to Jeff now.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Justin. Catherine, thank you. You have set a very, very high bar for all of our future events. This was really terrific. As I'm sitting here, I have texts and emails coming in from friends who are watching, telling me how wonderful this is. So thank you for making this a big success. And you are officially a member of the club here, so don't be a stranger. So again, Justin, thank you for all that you've done, and for everyone who's at the ICS who's been helping us get off the ground. Our next event is going to be November 8th, which we hope to be in person. The aforementioned Andrew Roberts is going to be speaking to the New York chapter. We anticipate it'll be in person. We're going to be in New York City. We're still we will be finding a venue. If it can't be done in person, we'll obviously do it virtually. And again, if you are interested in joining the group, if you're already a member, I think you just kind of let the ICS know. And if you want to join ICS and be a New York member as well, we welcome that. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Justin. Thank you, Catherine, again.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great fun. I hope you have a lovely evening.
You too.
Thanks, Jeff, and many more to come. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and take care.
Thank you.